Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, May 7th around here, and we got a great show for you today. We will start talking about Sherrone Moore's suspension, something that I did not expect to pop up this week, but definitely want to get that off the plate first. We'll get into a couple other big-time storylines, but that was the biggest from this past week, so definitely want to jump into that first. Then we'll get into a little bit of a spring recap. There's a number of things that happened throughout spring practice that with a little bit of a hiatus, haven't been able to get into as much as I would want to. Want to do a brief overview, and then we'll start to get a little bit more nitty-gritty per team as we go forward through the next couple of weeks, and then we'll finish it off. I'll do my post-spring top 10. We'll be coming out with the top 25 here pretty soon, but top 10 is where I feel comfortable ranking these teams right about now, and we'll get into that at the very end of the show. But let's go ahead and jump into this. Let's start with the biggest story of the week, which is Sherrone Moore will be suspended for 2 games this upcoming year in the 2025 season, at least 2 games. These are self-imposed sanctions coming from that Connor Stalions scouting scandal that has been quite a bit old now at this point, but Michigan is still kind of paying the penance for some of the crimes that they committed. But Sherrone Moore is the one that is getting the boot right about now. He is going to be suspended for 2 games this upcoming season, and it sounds like it is going to be weeks 3 and weeks 4 against Central Michigan and then at Nebraska. Now, that Nebraska game is very, very interesting. The other thing to note here is he will not be able to coach in the week leading up to the games. I know when Jim Harbaugh was suspended in the past for these same type of things, he was allowed to coach up until the game and then wasn't allowed to be there on Saturday. That will not be the case in this scenario. He will not be allowed around the team throughout the week. So this will be a little bit more intensive, a little bit more of an intense ban than they gave to Jim Harbaugh a couple of years ago, but definitely something that it felt like Michigan had to do something, right? But suspending him for the 3rd and 4th games of the season made some people raise some eyebrows, and there is a relatively good reason why they didn't do the first 2 games. The first 2 games are New Mexico and then Oklahoma. And if you know anything about Sherrone Moore, he did go to Oklahoma back in the day. He played offensive line there for a number of years, was an incredible player for the Sooners, and he wants to coach against his former team. So I have to assume that's why they ended up doing the 3rd and 4th week. If they could do it, they probably would have done the 1st and 3rd week, but at the end of the day, that probably would have raised a couple more eyebrows around the NCAA. And I think it's really interesting, breaking down this kind of ongoing saga that has been going around Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we all kind of knew that Sherrone Moore, being kind of the last one there from that old crew, was going to be the one that probably got the brunt of the pain when it came to the actual infractions and came to the punishment that was going to come from Michigan. A lot of it was going to be put on Sherrone Moore's shoulders. He understood that when he took the job. I'm 100% sure of that. Now, is this enough? Becomes the big time question. Is this enough to keep the NCAA off his back? He wants to coach against his former team where he had so much success. Is he going to be able to do that, or will the NCAA see through kind of a sidestepping of some of the responsibility here and trying to just see if this is preemptive, see if they can get the NCAA off their case just a little bit by doing a little bit of a self-imposed suspension on their head coach. So that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. The other interesting thing here that doesn't necessarily have to do exactly with Michigan football, but is very important in this entire landscape, is Santa Ono, the former Michigan president, had been there for a very long time, was there when all of this was going on, was there with Jim Harbaugh, did a lot of different stuff, and has been a very well-known name around college sports recently. He is moving on. He's going to be the president of the University of Florida going forward, so that asks even more questions. He would be the person that would be as much in tune with what the NCAA is going to do as just about anyone around there. Is he a little bit nervous about what's coming down on Michigan here pretty soon? And is he someone that kind of pushed for this to be maybe a little bit more aggressive, and the Michigan football team wasn't quite willing to do that? So there's a lot of different moving parts here. This is a small piece of this. This is something that at the very least kind of caught my eye when I was going through Twitter, and this kind of came up on my page right as all of this stuff was going on. You're thinking, maybe this is a little bit deeper than we're thinking right about now. Maybe the NCAA is really gearing up for something a little bit bigger, and Michigan's just trying to get ahead of it. But more than anything, it comes down to that guy right there. What is Charlie Baker going to do? How is he going to handle this situation? Is he going to bring the hammer down on Michigan, or was this enough? Was this enough to kind of get him off the scent, allow them to breathe just for a little bit longer, and allow Michigan to say, we suspended them for 2 games, one of which being a road conference game? That's got to be enough, right? And everyone moves forward, and maybe that's the case. Maybe the NCAA is more than fine with what Michigan just did, and they say, okay, that's more than enough of a punishment, and they move on forward with their business. Obviously, they don't quite have the teeth to put in a lot of the penalties that they might want to in some of these cases, so it could just be kind of cutting your losses and saying, we'll take wins where we can get them, but I do think there's the other coin of that. There's the other side of the coin where you look up at the NCAA and they say, we see what you're doing. We see that you're trying to sidestep whatever aggression or whatever punishment is coming down from us. That doesn't make us all that happy. A lot of people are kind of toying around with the NCAA in different ways, saying they don't have a lot of power. We might as well do their job for them. We might as well, push them into a corner and say, we've already done a suspension. We've already done a punishment for our head coach. Why would you come in here and add to that punishment? The NCAA might be a little bit fed up with teams kind of having that approach to the NCAA as a whole, and that'll be an interesting thing to watch. It'll all come down to the way Charlie Baker handled this, and it sounds like June 5th and 6th is really when we're going to get a quote-unquote resolution to this. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit more interesting as you get forward, but at the end of the day, we're probably reaching the end of this Michigan sign-stealing saga now. Connor Stallions, I'm sure, will have another 5 documentaries for some reason, but at the end of the day, at least in terms of the punishments for Michigan, it feels like this thing is winding down. Will this be enough? Will this be the end of this, or will Charlie Baker and his team come together and say, don't necessarily love that they're sidestepping those first 2 weeks. Maybe we suspend them for those as well. And that'll be an interesting thing to watch. Even losing that Nebraska game is going to be really interesting because that's a Nebraska team that could start 3-0 playing Cincinnati, Akron, and Houston Christian. And then you got to go to Lincoln to play that game. So that'll be a really interesting one. Maybe the damage will be done for Michigan season in that one loss. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in that, and definitely a game that you want to have your head coach for. So maybe the NCAA will say that's enough. Maybe they'll say Sherrone Moore has paid his penance. He is not necessarily the kingpin of this operation. He's just the guy that kind of got left with the short end of the stick in this situation. So maybe they're more than fine with those 2 weeks. Maybe they want to add the first 2 weeks to that, maybe make him lose his chance to coach against his alma mater. There's a lot of different things at play here, but it does sound like around June 6th, June 7th, we'll have a real answer. We'll see what happens with the NCAA if they convene and say that's more than fine for Michigan. We'll move forward. We'll let you kind of take your punishment as you see fit and kind of just move on about our business? Or do they say Michigan's trying to dodge a bullet here, and they definitely are. This is definitely preemptive of something coming from the NCAA. Will it be enough to dodge the full bullet, or will it make the hit just that little bit worse because it feels a little bit condescending to the NCAA? And I think it could go either way. It'll be really interesting to watch, and definitely something that the Wolverines are very much hoping they have their coach for those first 2 games, but I think the NCAA could have a little bit more to say about these punishments. Definitely something to watch. Definitely something that we will get into once we know the official punishments on top of this. Maybe it's just this and we can move forward knowing exactly what Michigan's going to have going into the season. Maybe the NCAA adds just a little bit more to these. And then we got a couple other big-time stories of the weekend. We'll start with Akron. Akron has a postseason ban for the 2025 season because of their academics. It sounds like throughout the last couple of years, what they have is an academic progress rate. Essentially, they break down how well is your team doing in getting people to the next level of their academic career. So making sure they pass all their classes, making sure they're at classes, making sure they're passing tests, making sure they're doing the things that a student athlete, quote unquote, should have to do. Akron has officially fallen below what the threshold of 930, and the way this works essentially is they have a rating system. If you fall below 930 for 1 year, you have certain punishments. They did last year. They were at 925. They got a couple of punishments. Now they're down at 914, so it's a multi-year APR score that has gone down pretty consistently throughout the last couple of years. They're officially below that 930 threshold for multiple years in a row. They are not eligible for the postseason in 2025. And it's something that's got to get figured out. This is the first time that someone's been banned from a postseason since 2014 with Idaho. That was when they moved down to the FCS. So Akron's got to be very, very careful here. They have to make sure they get this in order. Obviously, you have a little bit more time to focus on this with knowing you won't play a postseason game. So it'll be a really interesting time around there. Maybe some players are still looking for ways to transfer out with some different rulings. It'll be really interesting to watch kind of all of this unfold, hoping that Akron gets this obviously back on track and gets in a position where they can play postseason football again. That's obviously something that they're going to have to deal with, and it could lead to a coaching change up there, could lead to a lot of different things going on up there in Akron, Ohio, but they will not play in a postseason game even if they go 12-0. They are not eligible for the CFP now. I don't think Akron's going 12-0, but in the hypothetical world, it wouldn't matter. So that's definitely a tough blow for them and something that you got to figure out. As much as we talk about the on-the-field results and how these kids aren't students anymore, this, that, and the other, and a lot of it is true. At the end of the day, you got to meet the marks. You got to at least meet the minimum requirements, and Akron hasn't. So that postseason ban will be in effect for 2025. Will it be in effect going forward in 26, 27? That's up to Akron at the end of the day. Then we had Jared Curtis, the number one quarterback in the 2026 class, come off the board. He is committed to Georgia, actually recommitted to Georgia, was committed to the Bulldogs a little bit earlier in the process, decommitted, started to look at his options a little bit more thoroughly, came down to Oregon and Georgia. Georgia was able to get him back in that class, and a remarkable player. One of those guys that really does fit what Georgia likes to do, has that running ability. I believe had 18 rushing touchdowns this past season in high school football. The kid's incredible. Whenever you watch his tape, it's very, very clear why he's the number one quarterback in the country this year. He's a very, very confident player out of Nashville, and he's one of those guys that is going to be able to elevate what Georgia does. And I think the big thing to take away here, and something that I'll write about on my blog here later in the week, is Georgia's really turning up the heat when it comes to offensive recruiting. Not necessarily tight end and running back. They've always been able to get the elite guys there, but you look at the quarterbacks they brought in, and Ryan Puglisi and Ryan Montgomery, two very, very highly touted guys, two very talented guys. Then you had the number one quarterback in the country the next year, and on top of that, this last cycle you had Talon Taylor, a top 10 five-star wide receiver, CJ Wiley not far from a five-star wide receiver, Landon Rowland, another guy that's very, very elite, definitely a guy that can make some plays. So when you look at this Georgia recruiting class, it's not a normal Georgia recruiting class, and it's probably for a good reason. It's not just the elite defensive linemen and the elite running backs and the elite tight ends. It's the elite everything, and especially a couple of elite wide receivers, and now you get the elite of the elite at quarterback. So, remarkable player, absolutely a guy that will come into that room pretty readily and probably compete right away. Now, Gunnar Stockton might be sticking around for 27. That's obviously a good problem to have, having all the quarterback talent they have, but Jared Curtis is about as talented as you're going to find in the quarterback class coming up, and he's going to find his way over to Athens, Georgia here pretty soon. That'll be a very, very interesting thing to watch, and this could be the guy that leads Georgia to another national title here in a couple of years. And then finally, want to get into this Clemson-Notre Dame talk. It sounds like Clemson and Notre Dame are setting up a 12-year contract to play games from 2027 all the way to 2038 every single year. Absolutely love it. Should be some incredible games, should set up a nice little rivalry for that time, maybe get a little bit more traction around Notre Dame joining some type of conference here pretty soon, but at the end of the day, love the games. It's going to be so much fun to watch. I think the one thing that we do have to be a little bit wary about here is, while Clemson in the ACC did kind of bury the hatchet for the time being, it's not all the way buried. It can definitely still be dug up, and I think in 2031 is when it probably will be dug up. That's when a lot of these TV contracts come due. That's when a lot of this stuff will start changing. Conference realignment will take a stranglehold on the sport once again around that time, and you hate to see it, but Clemson's doing something that I think might just help them when it comes to joining the SEC or joining the Big Ten. The goal is to have inventory. The goal is to have chips to bring to the table when you're negotiating different contracts and setting up yourself for the future. You got to have these games. You got to have a Georgia on the schedule like they've had the last couple of years. Or if you can set up Notre Dame for that amount of time, the Big Ten's going to look at that and really love that. The SEC is going to look at that and really love that, adding that to their repertoire. So it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. I'm not saying this is a bad thing by any means. I love that Clemson and Notre Dame are going to get on the field, and I very much hope it doesn't lead to any more conference realignment. But this feels like a little bit of a move from Clemson. This feels like, hey, let's add another great inventory to our already great amount of teams that we play, but let's add a great one. Let's add an elite team that is going to get great viewership, that we can go to the SEC in 2031 and say, you still have 7 years of this game. You still have more than enough time to get all the inventory you want, and then we'll schedule someone else. Or maybe we'll keep scheduling Notre Dame because we have that relationship. So there's a lot going on here. I don't think it's just about the games. Now, I'm very excited about the games. It sounds like Miami and Florida State could be looking into doing the exact same thing with Notre Dame. So something to watch there at the very least. It feels like a very, very good move for this first couple of years. It could be a long-term plan for Clemson to have all the ammo they need to find their way out of the ACC. So just a little bit I don't mean to, rain on the parade by any means. I think the games are going to be incredible and cannot wait to watch them. But I think the next time that someone makes a decision purely based off what the fans want will be the first time in college football. So I'm going to say that Clemson's playing a little bit of a long game here. We'll see what happens with that. We'll see if it actually equates into anything, or I'm just doing a little bit of pie in the sky here. But at the end of the day, going to be some incredible games, and we'll see how that kind of develops over the next 4 years. But an incredible amount of stuff going on in the world of college football. Obviously, the Sherrone Moore suspension is kind of taking the cake right now, and that will take the cake for the next couple of weeks. As we get closer to that official NCAA decision, we'll figure out much more about what's going on there and if that punishment was enough, or the NCAA has a little bit more in store for Sherrone Moore. That will be something to watch. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, let's just talk about spring practice. Let's do a quick recap. Not quite as many stories as you usually have out of spring, and that's actually something we'll talk about, but we'll get into all of it right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the Sherrone Moore suspension. He will be suspended for games 3 and 4 of this upcoming season. Will he be suspended for games 1 and 2? Probably up to Charlie Baker and the NCAA, and we'll see where they end up landing on that. But moving on forward here, spring practice has officially come to an end all around the country. Washington's always kind of the last straggler out there. They had their spring game this past weekend, so we are officially into the summer months and what I like to call the championship months. The months where you really figure out who's going to win a championship, who's not, because it falls on the players going forward. Over the next, couple of weeks, over the next month or so, it falls fully on the players and the leaders of those teams to get everyone together, to do those couple extra workouts, to get all the wide receivers together to make sure the timing between the wide receiver and the quarterback is fully on mark. All of that stuff happens right about now, and I think that's where you win championships. But let's go ahead and jump into this, and let's talk about one of the bigger storylines of the spring is we still got a lot of unknowns, and I think it's because we didn't get to see as many spring games as we usually do around this time of year. You didn't have Texas playing a spring game, you didn't have USC, I believe, playing a spring game, and then a couple of teams just didn't have them on TV. You just had to go to the stadium if you wanted to watch. Now, we got plenty of intel. It's not to say that we have no intel coming out of spring and we're all just going in blind going into the next season, but I think when you come out of spring, I feel like everyone has, I don't want to say set opinions, but feel pretty good about certain teams and feel not so good about other teams. Right now, I feel pretty good about a lot of teams and not great about any of them. I'm very, very kind of a lot of unknowns out there for so many different teams. I think when you talk about Texas, how good was Arch Manning throughout this practice? It sounds like it has been incredible. Is it really been incredible, or is it just we haven't seen it? So a lot of different things that are still kind of going around, a lot of unknowns, and less spring games kind of gives you that. So that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. I would love to see more spring games kind of get piled back into the mix starting next year. I think there's a right way to do it. I think getting rid of the spring portal might be the best way to do it, just so teams don't have to worry about that poaching aspect that was brought up a number of times when teams were canceling those spring games. So there's a lot of different things at play here. But I think when you look at those post-spring top 10s, then I'll do mine here in a second, I think you'll find a lot of teams up there at number one. Some say it's going to be Texas. Some say Penn State. A couple still have Ohio State up there. I've seen a couple with Clemson there. So there's a lot of different teams that are coming out of spring, and usually you'd be able to pinpoint a team and say, that's the best team in the country. That's the team that's going to at least be the on-odds favorite to win the national title. I don't think you have that this year. I think we had Ohio State last year that ended up being the team that won it. I don't think you have that, and maybe we do have it. It's just not being known right now because we just haven't seen these teams play all that much. So part of me loves this. The intrigue of it all is very, very interesting. Part of me wants to get a little bit more intel, be able to watch spring football, and I think we all kind of agree that around this time in spring football has felt a little bit more special in past years, and this year just leaving a little bit to be desired. So we'll see what happens. Maybe Dion in Colorado and Fran Brown in Syracuse can get together next year and add a little bit of spice to spring. But at the end of the day, still a lot of unknowns, and I think those spring games going away have a lot to do with that. And then we got a ton of transfer quarterbacks, and this doesn't even scratch the surface of guys that are going to a new school and getting ready to play. But these three guys I've heard a lot about throughout spring practice, and we'll start with Carson Beck. Carson Beck has officially been cleared to throw the football over there at Miami. Came kind of at the wrong time, right? You finished spring practice, now you're starting quarterback from throw the football. It falls on him now. He's got to be the leader of that team. He's got to be able to get all those guys out to a field and get them ready to roll. He's got to be able to get JoJo Trader out there, and they just added the wide receiver that I'm now blanking on. Keelan Marion is who I was thinking of. Incredible player that he's going to have to get out onto a random IM field and get him to throw passes so they can get that timing, get everything down right, because he hadn't been able to throw the last couple of months throughout spring practice. Definitely will be a really interesting thing to watch, and could come down to that in that first week game against Notre Dame. How ready is he? How close are him and those wide receivers? And is he even fully healthy at that point? Will be something to watch. As of right now, he can throw, and now it's about just taking those steps forward. Then you got John Mateer in the middle right there, and he has probably been the darling of spring practice if I had to pick one. There's always that one player that really does, fly off the shelf, that has everyone talking, and I think last year was Jeremiah Smith for some very interesting, for some different reasons, but John Mateer has come into an Oklahoma team that needs something. They need a reason to believe. They need a reason to say that we can find a way to get to maybe 9 wins, get to maybe even 8 wins, and be in a conversation for the SEC. I think when you have John Mateer, you always have a shot. He's one of my top 5 quarterbacks in the entire country. They added Jaden Ott right next to him, the running back from Cal, incredible player that, as long as you keep him healthy, will make special plays for you. Sounds like the O-line is playing a little bit better, so Oklahoma's starting to believe again, and I think number 10 has a lot to do with that. A remarkable quarterback and a guy that gives you a chance in just about every single game you're going to play this year. Now, we obviously still know the running game is not going to be elite. The offensive line still has some issues, so it's going to be interesting for Oklahoma nonetheless. But John Mateer has been everything Oklahoma fans could possibly have wanted throughout the spring practice. Now it's time to really kick it into high gear and get ready for the season. And then Fernando Mendoza shining at Indiana as well, a guy that came into Indiana after Curtis Rourke walked out. He's a more talented player than Curtis Rourke. Can't promise that he's going to play better because experience is a big part of this, only going into his second year starting, his first year in that system. It'll be really interesting to watch what he can do and how he kind of develops over the next little bit. But very, very talented, obviously did a great job throughout spring, and it's catching the eyes of a lot of NFL draft scouts going into this year. So a very, very talented kid, absolutely a guy that can get Indiana going. And they follow up last year with another year where they're at the very least in the CFP conversation. Kurt Cignetti's probably not going anywhere around Bloomington for quite some time. So an incredible player in all three of these guys. Hugely important. All three of these teams could find a way to make a run to the CFP. All three could fall on their face in really bad ways, and it's going to come down to those three guys right there. Then we got QB battles all over the country, and this one seems to have been relatively decided. Over in Notre Dame, Steve Angeli has walked out the door. He has made his way over to Syracuse, which is a great fit for him. Cannot wait to see what he can do over there. I think Fran Brown showed everyone last year that he gets the right guy in that room to be his quarterback. They can do some special things. So I think Steve Angeli had a great spot there, but it sounds like the guy that kicked him out the door, proverbially kicked him out the door, is CJ Carr. Very talented young quarterback, a guy that's going into his redshirt freshman year, and he can sling the ball all over the yard. He is definitely the most talented thrower of the ball on this team. Even when Steve Angeli was there, he was very much the most talented thrower out there. I think Kevin Minchie still will have a little bit to say in this conversation. I could see a lot of packages for him kind of in that run game, because that would add a whole new dynamic to this offense, but it sounds like it's CJ Carr's job. It sounded like this was a battle for quite some time, but CJ Carr has wowed them enough. Really like this quarterback. Don't know if it's going to be quite as good as what they had with Riley Leonard last year, but I know that run game is going to be really good. I know that defense is going to be downright nasty. I think CJ Carr will be more than fine as long as all of that other stuff works out the way that I think everyone expects it to. Then you got Ohio State, another QB battle that Ryan Day just refuses to tip his hand, but I would be shocked if it was not Julian Sayin. Now, Lincoln Kienholz is holding in there, and I think that's probably the more important part of this, is Lincoln Kienholz seems to be firmly in the number 2 spot, or at least firmly fighting for that number 1 spot, if not in that number 2 spot, and Tavian St. Clair is not. And I think that's the bigger thing here, where not to say that Tavian St. Clair wouldn't have been a great backup for this team, but to say you'd like the guy with a little bit more experience to be the one that jumps in and has to run an offense. Lincoln Kienholz has the most experience among these quarterbacks going for this job right now. I do think it'll be Julian Sayin. I think he fits that little bit more of that CJ Stroud mold that Ryan Day loves so much, and with Ryan Day calling the plays this year, makes a lot of sense that it's going to be him at quarterback. I tend to believe that's going to be him. Lincoln Kienholz is pushing very hard. I think it's more encouraging that Lincoln Kienholz is even making this a fight. Whether or not it's all that close, I don't know, but Kienholz being a very confident quarterback going into next year will be important for Ohio State in case this Julian Sayin thing just doesn't work out as perfectly as they would like. Moving on to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, it's Ty Simpson's job to lose. As of right now, when I picked these earlier in the spring, I leaned Austin Mack. I felt like he knew the offense. I felt like with Ryan Grubbs coming in, he was going to enjoy having Austin Mack there, and it was going to lean that direction. Ty Simpson's continued to take control of this job. So it does feel like it is going to be his job. DeBoer is not going to pick a quarterback until rather late in this process, if I had to imagine, but the times that he's picked a quarterback, it's done pretty well for him. Last year was an interesting situation with Jalen Milroe, where he was not taking him out of that out of just about any game, and he probably shouldn't have. But at the end of the day, I think this is going to be his full quarterback decision, and it sounds like it's going to be Ty Simpson. Very talented kid that absolutely could play really good football. I think Keelan Russell is pushing for that backup spot, so definitely a guy to watch down the road. But it sounds like it's Ty Simpson's job to lose. I wouldn't be surprised if they announced this one pretty early on in fall camp. And then Colorado, the one that is very interesting to me because both quarterbacks looked pretty good during their spring game. Julian Lewis showed a lot of ability throughout that spring game. I'd still lean Caden Salter in this one. I think it's going to be a little bit closer than I once thought. I heard some people think that Julian Lewis was going to redshirt. I don't think that was ever the plan for Colorado. I think ideally, maybe that's the way that this would go down with Caden Salter playing really good football, but I don't know. Julian Lewis, is playing really good football for the Buffs right about now. I'd still lean Caden Salter because of the experience, because of the mobility, but definitely a very interesting one to watch, and Deion's not letting anyone know before that Week 1 game against Georgia Tech. I can almost promise you that. And then we got some of the bigger portal moves in the spring portal cycle, and there were a lot more than this. I promise you that. But as I see it, Nico Iamaleava, Joey Aguilar, that kind of trade that happened between UCLA and Tennessee took the cake for a lot of this, obviously. But then Trevor Pena, very talented wide receiver from Syracuse that apparently was asking for a pretty penny from Syracuse, has found his way down to Penn State, a guy that Penn State needs very badly. We'll talk about them in the next segment, as you can imagine, and that is a huge addition to an offense that really feels like they have a wide receiver core that could be special this year for the first time in maybe my lifetime, if I'm being totally honest. Then you do have Jaden Ott joining Oklahoma. We talked about that a little bit earlier with John Mateer. If this guy is healthy, he's one of the best running backs in the country. He can catch the ball out of the backfield incredibly well, has elite breakaway speed, has very, very solid contact balance. He's a very good running back. He's absolutely someone that, as long as him and John Mateer are on the field at the same time, that's one of the best backfields you're going to find around the country. Keelan Marion, another guy we talked about a little bit earlier with Carson Beck, and definitely a guy that can have a huge impact for Miami. One of those guys that maybe you didn't notice too much for BYU throughout the season. He can make plays in the kick return game and the punt return game, can make plays down the field, is very, very shifty. One of those guys that I just feel like if he's in a more central role for an offense, he could be one of the big-time players in the entire country. So definitely a guy to watch there. Murad Watson, a defensive lineman from Syracuse as well, much like Trevor Pena, finding his way over to Texas. Texas has loaded up on the defensive line, has added, I believe, 5 different guys to kind of backfill those positions left by Alfred Collins and Vernon Broughton that just had their names called this past weekend. So remarkable player, absolutely a guy that will make immediate impacts for the Longhorns, and he was a freshman All-American last year, so that doesn't hurt by any means either. Very talented kid and absolutely will have a huge impact for the Horns. Elo Medozi is another guy to watch. Came over from Army, an edge rusher going down to Athens, Georgia. This guy's a freak, an athletic beast, and someone that with a couple of months with Kirby Smart, with a couple of months with Glenn Schumann and all the guys down there, he could do some really special things this year. I think he's a huge addition to a group that is not all that stacked when it comes to edge rushing. I love Gabe Harris, another name to watch down there in Athens, but Elo Medozi is a guy they very badly needed, and I think they got an absolute gem, frankly. We talked about Steve Angeli finding his way over to Syracuse. Have to assume he's going to be the starter. Ricky Collins still kind of looking to see if he can edge out a spot for himself. I think it's going to be Steve Angeli. I think that experience really does help out. Sounds like a Kyle McCord type situation for this year for Syracuse once again. Gio Lopez going down to North Carolina. This was the thing that kind of kept Nico Iamaleava from finding his way to Chapel Hill was Gio Lopez decided to go for a little bit less money than Nico was looking for. But Gio Lopez, very talented kid from South Alabama, absolutely someone that elevates what North Carolina can do. And if you look at that North Carolina schedule, it's very, very manageable. You have an electric quarterback like this, you could do some really special things. But obviously, we'll talk about North Carolina plenty on the football field. We will not talk about off the football field very much. But at the end of the day, great pickup for UNC. Definitely will be their starter and will be a really good player for them long term. And then Bo Atkinson, another edge rusher that Georgia was looking at before they got Elo Mendoza. Very talented guy from North Carolina, finding his way up to Ohio State, losing Jack Sawyer, losing JTT. They needed some guys, and there's a very athletic, very rangy guy on the outside that is going to make a lot of plays for the Buckeyes this upcoming year. So a remarkable group of guys in the spring portal class. Obviously, was a little bit messy at times with Nico, with Joey Aguilar, with all of the craziness there. It got a little bit crazy, and I don't think any of us want it to get that crazy again, but always appreciate a couple of really interesting players moving around. I love the Keelan Marion pickup from Miami. In fact, I love a lot of the pickups that Miami has done the last couple of weeks. They've done a great job kind of filling out that roster the way that they want to. And overall, spring practice has come to an end. As I said in the beginning of it, this is when championships are won. This is when everyone gets together in some IM field at the very end of the campus, and you find a way to get a couple more reps in. And that's when the championship teams are born. So we'll find out what happens. Once we get to fall camp, we'll get a better idea of who was really out there and who really wasn't. But let's take our final break here. When we come back, let's talk about my post-spring top 10. We'll be coming out with a top 25 here pretty soon, probably towards the weekend. But as of right now, only felt confident with my top 10. Feel pretty good about it, and we'll break it down right after this. So stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did a little bit of a spring recap. Obviously not quite as many storylines as we're used to having. A couple of those spring games getting canceled did not necessarily help with all the narrative talking that usually happens around this time, but we still got plenty to break down, and we still have some different narratives to push. So let's talk about some of my post-spring top 10, because there's a lot of different teams that I think have bumped up a little bit in my mind, a couple of teams that have bumped down just because I've thought about it a little bit more. It's an interesting list, an interesting group of teams to put together, but I think when I look at this, these 10 teams I feel pretty good about. Now, the order of them I think you can play around with a little bit, and number 10 is one that I think is all up for debate. I think there's probably about 10 or 12 different teams you could slot in at that 10 spot, and I wouldn't fight you too much, but as of right now, in my number 10 spot, I got Arizona State. Arizona State Sun Devils are still going to be a really, really good team going into next year, and I think the number one thing people worry about with Arizona State is the run game. Is the run game going to be okay without Cam Scatterbo kind of carrying the load? Love what Kyson Brown brings to this team. I think he's a very, very good player that just happened to be behind one of the best running backs in the entire country. They also brought over Kanye Udo from Army. Really good running back. A little bit more of that Cam Scatterbo bounce off guys type of bowling ball type players. Really, really talented guy. Could be a very formidable duo. And then you add that to what Sam Levitt brings in the run game. They will be more than fine. Obviously, might not get the production they got last year, but when you have a guy like Jordan Tyson on the outside, which obviously helps this ranking quite a bit as well, you're going to be more than fine. He's a very, very good player. I love Chamon Metier, the tight end for them. I think they have a lot of really, really fun players. Malik McClain should take another step forward. They've added a couple other guys from the portal. I think Kenny Dillingham knows exactly what he's doing going into this season. I think Sam Levitt will take that next step where he's maybe not all over the place the way he was in that Texas game at different times, but overall, remarkable team. I think the back end of that defense is very, very talented after a year where it was a little bit of an issue at times. Definitely got them exposed at times, especially in that Texas game, but they got a lot of talent. A lot of guys coming back, added a couple of guys from the portal. I think it's going to be a really fun team over there in Tempe, Arizona, and I think Kenny Dillingham is gearing up thinking, we should be right back in the CFP. That is what he's thinking right now. Now, BYU and a number of other teams will have plenty to say about that in the Big 12, but Arizona State is the favorite right now, and I'm leaning towards the Sun Devils as the best team in the Big 12 going into this season. Alabama's my number 9 team, a team that I was very worried about going into this offseason. I'll be totally honest. I think when you have Ryan Williams being your leading receiver and then you don't necessarily have a lot to go after him, well, they fixed that. Isaiah Horton coming in from Miami is a massive pickup. Brings that wide receiver 2 that it felt like they were missing a year ago. And then Jeremy Bernard can fit into that wide receiver 3 position that feels like it makes more sense for him. So I think the wide receiver core is going to be maybe not, vintage Alabama elite, but I think it's going to be more than enough. I think it's going to be very, very talented. And I think when you look at Kalen DeBoer, he can do plenty with a group like that. With Ryan Williams, Isaiah Horton, and Jeremy Bernard, he'll have plenty of fun. I can promise you that. The other incredible group is the linebacking core. This is something that Josh Pate talked about with Kalen DeBoer when they spoke in a great series that Josh Pate does, breaking down a lot of different stuff around the country. But Deontay Lawson going down in 2024 kind of worked out for Alabama. Now, obviously, you never want to see someone get injured, but he's found his way back to school. Justin Jefferson has found his way back in that linebacker room. It's going to be terrifying. It's going to be a very, very elite group. Even losing Jahad Campbell, I think it got a little bit better this upcoming year, and I think that's the core of every great Alabama defense is having those elite linebackers. Whether it's Dante Hightower, or it's Reuben Foster, or any of these guys over the past little bit, you got to have those guys in the interior or in the center of that defense. Alabama's going to have those guys. There's no doubt about that. And then on top of all of this, it's finally Kalen DeBoer's team. I know last year he was the head coach of that team, but there were a lot of different things behind the scenes that made it very hard for him to really put his teeth into this team the way that he wants to. It sounds like the vibes are entirely different around Tuscaloosa as it was last year. It sounds like they're moving in the right direction, and at this point, Kalen DeBoer has proved beyond reasonable doubt that he is going to be an elite coach. He's going to put a great product on the field, and it's Alabama. So I'm going to keep them at number 9 right now. Could very much shoot up these boards very quickly early on in the year. Oregon here at 8. This is the one that I think I'm a little bit lower on than the majority of people that will make these rankings around this time. Right now, Dante Moore looks the part, so that is not a worry. The quarterback that is taking over does look the part, does look like a guy that is going to be able to lead you where you want to go, which is a national championship. That is what Oregon is after. The one question that I do have is the rebuilt offensive line. Not to say they didn't get great players. Isaiah World from Nevada, very fantastic, huge player that will play tackle for them. Alex Harkey from Texas State, very talented guy, another tackle for them. Emmanuel Pregnon coming over from USC. They've done a very nice job getting talent. You never know what it's going to look like going from Nevada to Oregon. You never know what it's going to look like going from Texas State to Oregon, or, UTEP to Texas, or any of these big time moves from the G5 to the power level. It's always interesting, especially at those tackle positions where you're facing just an entirely different animal. When you go up to that next level, that is the one thing I worry about. It sounds like it's going relatively well right now. It'll be really interesting to watch this team going forward. They lost quite a bit on defense. I have full faith that Dan Lanning is going to get this team ready, that they will be one of the elite teams in the Big Ten. I'm just not quite as bullish on Oregon as a number of other people are out there. And then you got LSU at 7. This is my team. I've fallen for LSU a number of years before, and I will fall for them again this year. I love this group. I think the things that they have done in the portal have been as well as just about anyone in the entire country. I think the guys they added on the back end with Mansour Daleem, with Jakeem Jackson, have been absolutely are incredible players that they very much needed. I think the wide receiver core with Barry and Brown and Nick Anderson coming in cannot be more great. And then the offensive line, you add a guy like Braylon Moore from Virginia Tech, a great pickup for an offensive line that is replacing quite a bit of guys. So that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. That would be the one thing I think that might end up holding back LSU is how quickly that offensive line come along. Sounds like it's going really well in spring practice. So feel pretty good about that right about now. That is the one place where I have a little bit of pause. But then I think they have one of the best, maybe the best quarterback in the entire country. I do have Cade Klubnik just a touch over Garrett Nussmeier, but Nussmeier can sling the rock. There's no two ways about that. He can lead one of the best teams in the country. They got to get that run game under control, and that's something we can talk about in subsequent weeks when we get through some of the questions going into the season for a couple of these teams. The run game is a huge one for LSU. There's no doubt about that, but I got them at number 7, feel pretty good about where they're at, and I think they're going to be a really fun team to watch that maybe, just maybe, could compete for that SEC championship. Notre Dame here at 6. Obviously, it's CJ Carr's turn. We talked about it a little bit earlier in the show. He's going to be young. That's going to be really, really interesting to watch, but the run game is going to help him out a ton. Jeremiah Love, in my opinion, is the best running back in the entire country. Jadarian Price is not very far down that list right after him as his kind of running mate in that backfield, so the run game will take care of a lot of it, the same way it did with Riley Leonard, but he's going to have to make throws. That is the one big thing here. Can CJ Carr, come along the way that he needs to? He's going to be going up against a guy in Carson Beck that has played a lot of football against a lot of elite teams in some very tough environments. It'll be really interesting to see how It'll be really interesting to see how CJ Carr kind of handles that going forward, and if he's someone that can really take that on his shoulders going into this season. The other part, the defense is loaded. I know they lost a number of players going to the draft this year with Xavier Watson, Benjamin Morrison, who was injured for for the majority of last year, but Leonard Moore, Drake Bowen, Jordan Clark, so many guys coming back on this defense that are going to be huge, huge players. Love the linebacking core they have. Love the corners they have that are going to be 1 year older. I think it's going to be an elite defense just like it was a year ago. And then the wide receiver core, much more talented. Jaden Greathouse obviously showed out in that Ohio State game, and especially that Penn State game where he made a number of big-time plays, but you had Malachi Fields, you had Will Pauling, you had Jordan Faison on the outside. It's a wide receiver group that, at the very least, is a whole lot more talented than Notre Dame has had in the past couple of years, and hopefully they'll be able to help CJ Carr out a lot, and losing Mitchell Evans is a little bit of a blow, but they more than made up for that with the wide receiver room as far as I'm concerned. Into the top 5, and I'll start with the Georgia Bulldogs here. I think this team is still really, really good. Now, the big question is Gunnar Stockton. Is he going to be a guy that is going to really take that big-time step? Now, the big news out of spring camp is he is the outright leader of this team, and that's a huge, huge thing. I think that's something that a lot of Georgia fans, including myself, frankly, would tell you that Carson Beck struggled with at different points throughout his career, was really taking a hold of this team, really being the outright leader. Doesn't sound like Gunnar Stockton is worried about that too much. He is the outright leader of this team, and that's a huge, huge thing. The other thing is the run game, and I think the huge addition that might have gotten overlooked just a little bit throughout the spring portal cycle because of all of the other craziness is Josh McCray coming from Illinois all the way down to Athens, Georgia. Is a very good player, a very physical running back, especially losing a guy like Branson Robinson to the portal. This is a great addition for this team, kind of a duo with Nate Frazier going into next season. It's going to be a really, really fun group. The offensive line looks very, very talented. Replacing some starters definitely will be a very interesting thing to watch there, especially Drew Bobo taking over at center. But at the end of the day, feel very confident in that group and feel very confident in Stacey Searles at least to put together a very solid group over there in Athens. But again, something that wasn't quite to the Georgia level last year. Got to find your way back up to that level. And then the biggest thing is the wide receiver signings. You add Zachariah Branch, you add Noah Thomas. Those guys are going to be doing huge things in the fall. They better do huge things in the fall because they've done some great things throughout spring camp. Zachariah Branch made a great play in the spring game for the Dogs. So a lot of good things going on over there at Georgia. Plenty of things to worry about, no doubt about that. Will that running game rebound? Will the offensive line be where it needs to be in week one? But at the end of the day, I feel pretty bullish that Kirby Smart's going to have those guys ready to go. And I think you add in all the wide receivers they got and a couple of the guys that are coming back this year, I think that offense is going to be more than formidable. Then we got Ohio State at 4, and that, again, maybe a little bit lower than some people will have them, but the QB battle is still technically alive. I do think it's going to be Julian Say, and I think he's in the lead right now. I just think Ryan Day's not going to let anyone know that until probably the Texas game kicks off, if I'm being totally honest. But on top of that, you got the two best players in the country. Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs are the two best players in the country, one on offense, one on defense. Enough said. You know exactly what you're going to get from those two guys, and then you just got to fill the pieces around them. And it's a whole lot easier when you got two guys that I think are going to go top 5 in the draft when they're officially ready to roll. And then the D-line is the one area where you will have questions, where I think a lot of Buckeyes fans have questions right about now. They've been able to add a couple of guys, but overall, it sounds like they got pushed around just a little bit in that spring game. Did not look all that pretty at times during spring practice overall. So they're replacing quite a few guys that are really, really incredible players that are moving on to the NFL. Didn't move on last year, but now are. They got to be ready, and they got to make sure that's in order because you get run all over against Texas. It's going to be a really long day for you, especially with what Arch Manning brings to that group. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch throughout fall camp. But as of right now, Ohio State still has the dudes. I think the quarterback's going to be great, and I think this team, even after a national title, is going to be plenty hungry coming into 2025. Clemson's my number 3 team in the country, and it starts on the defensive side of the ball. Cade Klubnik's going to be his own conversation, but as of right now, TJ Parker coming off the edge, absolutely terrifying, will be the number 1 edge off the board, maybe the number 1 player off the board in the 2026 NFL Draft. Peter Woods will go not far behind him in that 2026 NFL Draft. You have Wade Wood as Sammy Brown as your linebackers, 2 very elite players, Avion Terrell on the back end. It's a ridiculous defense. It's a defense that will be as talented, as experience, as incredible as anyone around the country, and they will give them a floor that will be very, very high. I can promise you that. You know, Clemson is not a team that I see bottoming out in any scenario, and there's quite a few teams that I could relatively see bottoming out in some scenarios. This is not one of those teams. Too good of a defense, too good of a quarterback that will make the right read. And I think the other part of this is Cade Klubnik, along with his trio of wide receivers. You have Bryant Wesco, Antonio Williams, and TJ Moore all back for this upcoming season. It's going to be terrifying. We saw what they were able to do against the Texas back end. That was very, very good, really all the way throughout the year, even in that Ohio State game where you had to deal with Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka and all those guys. They did a really good job. Clemson kind of got to him a couple of different times because those 3 guys are so talented. And then another kind of fun little tidbit here that I also got from Josh Pate, so huge shout out to him, but the kind of draft science that goes into this, the most first-round picks have always been the team that wins the national title tends to have the most first-round picks that upcoming draft. In the mock drafts for the 2026 draft, it would be the Clemson Tigers right about now, with about 3.2 guys being drafted around the mock drafts from all the different places. It will be an interesting thing to watch. Maybe that's your national title winner right about now if that holds true for another year. I believe it's been 7 out of the last 8, with Michigan being the only one to not hold that up. Maybe Clemson can do it this time around. And the team right behind them on that list is the Texas Longhorns. I have them at number 2. so far, it sounds like Arch looks the part. Now, we didn't get to see a spring game, so that's still a little bit of a question. They added the quarterback from the portal that people made a little bit too big of a deal out of, but at the end of the day, it is Arch Manning's team. It sounds like he's being a very, very vocal leader for this team, and it sounds like he's plenty comfortable. So, no huge worries there, no alarm bells going off in Austin that they got this wrong or Arch isn't the guy. Sounds like everything's going very much according to plan. Young wide receivers are stepping up in big ways for this Texas group. Ryan Wingo went down early on in spring practice. You also had Sherrone Moore not even play throughout spring. So everyone out there had not caught a pass in college football. Parker Livingstone, a guy to watch. Dalen McCutcheon, another guy to watch. Two guys that sound like they're running with the first team right about now, and very, very talented players that could make, or pretty much need to make, huge impacts for Texas. Now, they were able to add another wide receiver to this group. They were able to add, now I'm blanking on his name. I very much apologize. Emmett Mosley. Emmett Mosley was the name that I was looking for. A great player out of Stanford that I think can kind of fill that Matthew Golden hole a little bit. Very, very talented, a very similar skill set to Matthew Golden from a year ago. So something to watch there. But overall, those young wide receivers are going to have to play big-time roles, and it sounds like throughout spring they're doing more than fine. And then the defensive side of the ball is what Texas is going to be known for this year. I think it might be even better than you had a year ago. Colin Simmons, in my mind, is the best edge rusher in the entire country. Anthony Hill's the best linebacker in the entire country. Michael Tass, probably one of the top 5 safeties in the entire country. Manny Muhammad, the same thing with corners. Jelani McDonald is a guy to watch on that defense, and among a number of other guys on that defense. Derek Williams, a safety that was injured all of last year, is finding his way back to the field this year. It's going to be a ridiculous defense. Incredibly talented, plenty of experience, plenty of leadership, and I think this is going to be, again, what Texas hangs their hat on, but hopefully they'll be able to get a little bit more out of Arch Manning and be able to get a little bit more out of that offense in some key circumstances. But at the end of the day, the defense is going to be incredible and, again, gives them a very, very high floor, much like Clemson. Penn State's my number 1 team in the country, and it's one of those things that I was very, very back and forth on. Do I want to trust James Franklin? Do I want to trust Penn State to make those plays that they haven't made throughout his time there? Trevor Pena being added to this equation is outright huge. He is someone that I think is very clearly the wide receiver 1. I think you have Kyron Hudson or Devontae Ross, whichever one kind of fills into that wide receiver 2 role, and then you have the other guy at the wide receiver 3. I think it's the first time for a very long time where I've looked at the 1, 2, 3 for Penn State and said, those are all uber talented players. Those are all players that absolutely could make big time plays for them and will end up making big time plays for them this year. And then you got the running back duo. Let's just be totally honest. This team is going to run the ball very heavily. Katron Allen and Nick Singleton are both downright elite. They both sit at 10th and 11th on the Penn State rushing charts right now, both about 1,000 yards away from that number 1 spot. Maybe they end number 1 and 2 at the end of this year. But overall, that's going to be their bread and butter. I just feel like that passing room feels so much more solid. And then another guy, Luke Reynolds, that tight end that's taking over for kind of that Tyler Warren placement, which is going to be nearly impossible to do, but he's making some big-time plays. Absolutely love what he can bring to that offense, and I think he's going to have a breakout season. So love what Penn State has been able to do. Feel a ton better about their passing game with the addition of Trevor Pena, and then the defense is in a really solid spot. Actually added Amari Campbell, very talented linebacker from UNC a week ago, or yesterday actually. They added him to an elite linebacker core already with Tony Rojas, with Dominic DeLuca, with some very, very good players. LeVar Arrington II looks like LeVar Arrington, and it's going to be a very, very fun team. The back end of this defense is downright as talented as you will find around the country. Penn State's a really good team, and I am going to be the guy that maybe looks a little bit stupid because I'm putting all my faith in James Franklin. I'm more than fine to do that. I think it's a very, very good team. I think they will be very good this season, and they might just be the team that ends up winning that national championship on January 19th. But overall, an incredible spring. I think there were so many different things to talk about. Obviously, some of the stuff, not necessarily stuff I love talking about. The Nico saga was upsetting in a number of different ways. The Bill Belichick stuff is stuff I don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. So there was a lot of different things going on this spring. At this point, it's a sprint to the opening weekend. I think everyone knows that right about now is when championships are won, championships are lost, and it'll be interesting to see who comes up to the top of the fray, who goes into fall camp feeling super confident about their abilities. It's going to be an awesome thing to watch. But It starts right now. All the craziness, all the stuff that we all love starts right about now. We're about 100 days away from this thing kicking off, and it's going to get real very, very quickly. But we'll be back next week. We'll get into a little bit more details about some of the big-time questions around some of the big-time contenders going into this year. We'll get into all of that type of stuff. We'll get into some transfer portal stuff. We'll get into all of it next week. There's going to be plenty of stuff that I'm sure I'm not thinking of right now, but will pop up on the Twitter feed here pretty soon. So we'll talk about it all next week. I will see you next time. So thank you for listening, and same time, same place next week.